All right, we are live. Joining me today, a very special guest, Andrew Lee. Andrew, thank you very much for joining me. For those who don't know you, could you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm Andrew Lee. I am a philosopher of consciousness. Um, I guess I'm technically unemployed right now. It's kind of an odd situation. So I got my PhD from NYU last year, and I did a postdoc at Rice University this past year. And originally, I was supposed to be now in Australia at Australian National University doing a postdoc through its Center for Consciousness. But because of coronavirus and because of Australia restricting travel from international visitors, I'm unable to go there right now. So my postdoc has been delayed. And in the meantime, I'm just hanging out in France for a while until I start, hopefully in January. But that sort of remains to be seen.
Wow,
Um,
okay. And then you have another postdoc lined up after that, I think, right? A 3-year one or
y-
something?
yeah, that's right. So after my ANU postdoc, I'll be a postdoc at the University of Oslo through another consciousness project.
Wow, that's very cool. That's the new normal, right? Three or four postdocs, then a faculty job.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully the new normal is not having your postdoc delayed for a long time and sort of getting in
Exactly.
limbo. But we'll see. Maybe that'll become the new normal too.
Yeah, well, I hope that clears up and that works out for you because I really want to see you succeed. I really enjoy your work. I've known you for a little while since you've been at NYU, and since I first saw you present a paper on the deep structure of consciousness at the Graduate Center, I think, and I was really captured by careful thinking and the approach that you take. So one of the things I think that I want to get into a lot of your stuff, but one of the things I think that kind of unites the various projects that you have is the application of formal techniques to the study of consciousness. So how important do you think formal techniques are? Do you think that is it just your interest, or do you think that there's something deeply important about these techniques that can help us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thought I have first is that I'm not sure if I am applying formal techniques to all of the work that I've done. A lot of my work, I think, is just good old-fashioned normal philosophy. But one area that I'm I've been interested in, and I'm increasingly interested in applying formal tools to, is to theoretical work on the structure of experience. And the way that I came about getting interested in this sort of research is my dissertation at NYU was on the structure of experience. And that came about because I thought to myself, like, there's all these philosophical discussions of consciousness, and they're all really interesting, but a lot of them are focused especially on questions about the nature of consciousness, on, for
Yeah.
example, the mind-body problem, or on the problem of perception, or sometimes on the relationship between consciousness and representational content. And it seemed to me that there are a lot of questions that we could ask about consciousness that allow us to remain neutral on these issues about the nature of consciousness and just ask, how are conscious experiences structured? And that seemed to me to be something that was relatively underexplored in philosophy, especially some fairly basic foundational questions about how conscious experiences are structured, like what does the state space for conscious experiences look like? Do experiences have parts, and in what sense? Do experiences have continuous or discrete structures? So I became increasingly interested in these sorts of questions. And one thing I realized is that if you're asking about the structure of any kind of phenomena, then inevitably one of the best tools that you're going to have for thinking about structure is formal tools. And I guess something that's a somewhat nascent, but uh, a somewhat nascent interest, but an interest that I think will persist for a while, is I'm interested in seeing what kinds of formal structure conscious experiences have, and what kinds of formal tools we can use to understand that structure.
Yeah, interesting. And one of the kind of lessons that I think that you want to take from the talking about the structure of experience is that there may be facts about structure that we can know. For instance, with respect to the experience of bats or other sorts of creatures, without necessarily knowing, I don't know, the specific qualities. I guess we might know the general structure of their experience without knowing any of the specific details. Can you tell us a little
Yeah,
bit about that?
that's exactly what I think. I mean, one way in which I pitch it is that I think that investigating the structure of experience is a way of developing uh, what we might think of as an objective phenomenology, a way of characterizing and describing and understanding experiences that doesn't require us to have the experiential capacities under question, under investigation. So I think that if we develop models of how bad experiences are structured, we might still not be able to fully grasp what it's like to be a bat, but we could still learn something about bad experiences. If I told you that like bad experiences have a three-dimensional structure similar to like our color experiences, then you would learn something about the phenomenology of bad experiences, even if you wouldn't be able to grasp the qualitative character of bad experiences. So I think that's one way in which investigating the structure of experience is interesting and promising. I think it's more epistemically tractable than investigating other aspects of consciousness. And I think some of the philosophical puzzles that we encounter when we try to understand the qualitative character of experiences, um, in some cases, they don't arise in quite the same way when we're investigating the structure of experience.
So can you give us an example of, I mean, you said maybe like a three-dimensional structure or something like that, but can you give us a little bit of idea about what sorts of things we may come to know structurally?
Yeah. So one of my recent papers is looking at the structure of mental qualities. And um, one of the uh, I think one of the domains of experience that we have particularly good models for are mental qualities, like the kinds of qualities that occur in color experience or sound experience or olfactory experience and so forth. And the standard method for developing a model of mental qualities is to represent them as points in a multidimensional space where the distances between the points correspond inversely to the degrees of similarity between the different mental qualities. So if you've ever seen like, the three-dimensional representation of colors where you have this big color block and three different dimensions of variation corresponding to hue, saturation, and brightness, that's an example of what people call a quality space. And that kind of structure can be used both to model colors, but also color experiences. If you think of this as a model of color experiences, we have this nice systematic representation of the three-dimensional structure of the different color experiences that at least humans can have. And one thing I've argued recently is that actually this kind of approach to modeling mental qualities that you might have thought is super general and will be applicable to any domain of mental qualities whatsoever is actually structurally inadequate. And that in order to adequately capture the structure of mental qualities, we need to uh, add more structure to our models. And in particular, what I think is that in order to capture what I call precision structure, so if you think about like the contrast between seeing something as, say, scarlet in foveal vision versus seeing something as, say, just red in peripheral vision, that's a matter of what I call precision. And I think that in order to capture imprecise mental qualities, the kind of experience that you have when you just see something merely as red rather than any specific shade of red, we're going to have to model mental qualities not as points in multidimensional spaces, but instead as regions in multidimensional spaces. And then once you make that move, there's all sorts of new, interesting um, questions that arise about the formal structure of this framework and what we can do with this formal structure. And that's sort of what I'm doing in that paper. But the core idea is that we need to make this fundamental shift from using one kind of formal apparatus to model mental qualities to a richer kind of formal apparatus.
Yeah, that's interesting. So um, can I just ask you a little bit? I mean, there's a lot I want to ask you about the mental qualities and this model that you have, which I think is really cool. But to sort of get into it, when you say that of a region, so you know, in a quality space model, kind of typically you would say, well, here's a point, and this point is maybe mental red, and it's more similar to mental scarlet than it is to mental green or whatever. So you have this region of points, this relationship of these points. When you want to transition to regions, are there still points within the region on your view, or is this sort of like a field model, or exactly how do we understand the region talk here?
I'm thinking of a region as a set of points.
Okay, yeah. So in that sense, then it's not such a radical departure from the kind of standard model of quality spaces. You're just saying that we have to capture, we have to add more, that there's this area of points that's of relevant interest.
No, it's not. I definitely wouldn't say it's a radical departure, but I do think it's a fundamental departure because the basic formal structure that's being used to model mental qualities has shifted from one kind of formal thing to another kind of formal thing. And I think that one of the cool things that arises from this is, well, you might at first think, yeah, this is a pretty simple kind of shift, points to regions that doesn't seem so like striking, but I think there's a lot we can do once we make this kind of shift. For example, one thing I talk about is how different hypotheses about the structure of imprecise experiences are going to correspond to different formal constraints within my framework. So for example, if we're thinking about color experiences, then we might suppose we just accept that, yeah, color experiences should be modeled using regions in multidimensional spaces rather than points in multidimensional spaces. Then we could ask, well, what kinds of regions actually correspond to possible mental qualities? Like, could there be a disconnected region that corresponds to an experience that represents something as either aquamarine or scarlet, but nothing in between? It's not clear that that's like a possible mental quality. And I think it's hard to even ask these kinds of questions before we have the relevant kind of theoretical apparatus and formal framework. So I think that's one example of how using these more sophisticated formal tools can really advance the philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, that's good, because I mean, it's not, so what I know it's a fundamental shift. I like that idea, but it's not as radical as like the switch from like saying, quantum mechanics from point particles to fields where,
Right.
there's no such thing as a point. It's just kind of excitations in the field. So
yeah, and in that respect, I'm thinking of this as building upon previous work on mental qualities. So it's not it's augmenting the what we had before.
yeah. So one thing I want to ask you generally about mental qualities is, do you, is it part of your view, or how generally do you think about the mental qualities in terms of consciousness? So can there be unconscious mental qualities that nonetheless are qualitative but not conscious? Or do you, on your way of thinking, associate the consciousness with the quality intrinsically or somehow?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question that's debated in the mental qualities literature. I'm largely agnostic on that question. I think that it seems to me that I feel like I can see a coherent philosophical picture either way. And I don't find any of the arguments either way decisive. I mean, obviously, this partly depends on what you mean by mental quality and what you mean by consciousness. But it seems to me that there is a precisification of consciousness and mental qualities where we can make sense of unconscious mental qualities. And then it just seems to me like, well, that's going to depend on what the best view about the metaphysical nature of consciousness looks like. And that seems to me to be something that's still up in the air.
So you would be perfectly, I mean, you're the kind of framework that you're developing would be perfectly amenable to having these quality spaces be unconscious and still modeled in terms of regions and so forth. There's nothing hanging on that.
Yeah. My primary interest is in conscious experiences. So I'm interested in mental qualities insofar as they characterize the phenomenal character of conscious experiences. But I think that if you were sympathetic to a picture where there are unconscious mental qualities, it's pretty easy to just apply everything I've done there to to that kind of picture, and to use the same kind of formal structure for thinking about the structure of unconscious mental qualities.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess the thought that I was sort of toying with was that I wonder why you wouldn't want two different frameworks for one for each. So maybe unconscious qualities could be modeled in terms of points, maybe conscious ones can be modeled in terms of regions of points. And so what would be the argument for thinking that you would want the same model applicable to both?
Well, I guess my thought is that if we can use a single model for a wider range of phenomena, then that's generally better. I mean, we shouldn't multiply, models beyond necessity. So, if there were some particular reason for thinking that we needed different models, if we had some kind of principled argument that the structure of conscious mental qualities was different from the structure of unconscious mental qualities, then that would be, motivation for developing different models. Of those two phenomena. But without that, it seems to me like, well, if we can have a single unified model that covers both domains, then that's all the better.
Yeah, because I mean, so there's some kind of empirical work which suggests that when you present stimuli to subjects and you ask them, are they different? They say no. But if you have them adjust, wavelengths or something like that, so that they can match the stimulus, and they turn out that they're different, suggesting maybe that unconsciously they're sensitive to the difference in the stimuli, but consciously they perceive them as indistinguishable. So maybe work like that might sort of be a wedge to think that there's two.
So that's interesting. But I think that kind of empirical result is fairly straightforwardly accommodatable within my framework. That seems to me to indicate that there's a difference in precision rather than a difference in the kind of general formal framework that we need to model mental qualities, conscious or unconscious. So it seems to me like if we take those empirical results at face value, then we might think that unconscious mental qualities are generally more precise than conscious mental qualities. And in virtue of being more precise, enable more fine-grained discriminatory abilities. But then that's still going to be capturable within the kind of framework that I have. And in fact, it'll be more, it'll be better capturable if we use just a single framework rather than multiple frameworks, because then we can ask, what does the degree of precision of the unconscious mental qualities look like in comparison to the degree of precision of the conscious mental qualities? Whereas if we had two fundamentally different types of models for the two phenomena, it's not clear we would be able to make these kinds of comparisons.
Yeah.
So I think one nice thing about having this unified framework that is neutral on a lot of different issues is that it allows for all sorts of comparisons that are difficult to make otherwise.
Yeah. So I mean, is the limit case of a region a point?
Yeah, you could think of that. I mean, we could talk about singleton regions that are comprised of just a single point.
So then the model so instead of having two models, you might just say that really what's going on is whenever you need to just talk about points, it's just a kind of limit case of a region. It's just a very singleton, small region.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think that we would never actually have to talk about regions that are comprised of just a single point. That seems to me to be an idealization of the model, sort of like that seems to be analogous to talking about something that has like an infinitesimally small mass or something like that. Just because, suppose it is the case that unconscious mental qualities are more precise than conscious mental qualities, then that seems to me to just mean that the regions that correspond to unconscious mental qualities are going to be smaller,
Right.
whereas the regions that correspond to conscious mental qualities will generally be bigger. But that's a matter of, that's just a matter of degree rather than like one of these two cases hitting up upon the edge cases of the model.
I see. So you doubt that there's going to be some like maximally specific, maximally precise mental quality that we would need to appeal to.
Well, I think it depends on what you mean by there is there. I mean, if that's a question about whether any human experiences will have structures that are best modeled by these ultra small, maximally small regions, then I doubt that. I just don't see any reason to think that that humans happen to have experiences that are as precise as they could possibly be. Another question is whether it's metaphysically possible for there to be experiences that are best modeled by just a single region. And I guess I'm not sure there. That I'm mostly agnostic there. Um, uh, so I think that's sort of an open question. But I guess it seems to me that for all practical purposes, for the purposes of like empirical inquiry and like, thinking about the structures of actual organisms and stuff, we'll never have to appeal to these limit cases.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. All right.
But
So
then
I wonder
if it happened
sorry.
to be the case that we did have to, then, the structure is there. So that's one nice thing too, that there's
Yeah.
flexibility.
Yeah, that is a nice thing. I mean, that's one of the things I really like about this model. It's flexible, and like you said, it opens up the possibility for asking questions that you couldn't ask on just the more limited model. So I like that aspect of it. I wonder what you might say to someone. So I mean, you talk about this in your paper on this. The predecessors of quality spaces. So Austin Clark, David Rosenthal. I was lucky enough. I studied with Austin at University of Connecticut. Was there, and of course I'm friends and have studied with David Rosenthal, so I'm somewhat familiar with their views. I wonder what you might say to the way I think that they might handle the precision case. So as far as I understand a view, that's kind of the more traditional quality space model. You have points or something like points. And so when you're presented with a stimuli, you have some maximally specific mental quality that's tokened in the mind. But then that very same mental quality, you can be aware of it in different ways. So there's some maximally specific shade of red, the mental quality's there. That shade of red you could be aware of as simply red, or you could be aware of it as crimson, or you could be aware of it as some maximally precise. So then the precision claim is taken care of in terms of the way the quality presents itself to you. But the quality itself is still a point on this model.
So just a clarificatory question here on your suggestion on behalf of Clark and Rosenthal. So is the idea that the way the quality presents itself to you, is that something that figures into the phenomenal character of your experience, or is the phenomenal character fixed by just the quality that is being represented?
So if we mean phenomenal character by what it's like for you to have it, then yeah, it's fixed by the way you're aware of it. But the qualitative aspect of it is fixed by so it separates the phenomenal character from the qualitative character.
So maybe here's a more complete answer. So it seems to me like there's two options here based off the question I just asked. So one option is to say the phenomenal character, the what is it likeness, it's just determined by the quality that you're aware of. And we're only ever aware of maximally precise or maximally specific qualities. So if one were to go that route, I guess that seems just phenomenologically implausible to me. I mean, if you just think about the contrast between your foveal color experience and your peripheral color experience, it seems obvious that, there's a difference in phenomenology, and that difference is something that any model of mental qualities ought to be able to capture. If, on the other hand, we go the way that you suggested, where the phenomenal character of, say, your color experience is determined not just by which quality you're aware of, but also by the way that you're aware of it. And the way that you're aware of it comes in degrees. So you might be more or less aware of different mental qualities. Then I'm wondering whether this is a somewhat verbal difference, because it seems to me like what I mean by mental qualities is not just the quality that you're aware of, to put in this language, but also the way you're aware of that mental quality. And that both of these things are what determine what it's like for you to, see the color of some object. So those are the things that I'm interested in modeling. Those are the things that I'm calling mental qualities. And I think to model that stuff, we need to appeal to regions. And then it might be just that I'm using the term mental quality in a somewhat different way than your interpretation of Clark and Rosenthal is using it.
Yeah. Well, that's why I asked at the beginning your feelings about unconscious qualities and whether anything in your view hung on that. so that it sounds like what you're saying now suggests that maybe something does hang on that, because you're saying I want to model the conscious ones, but someone like Rosenthal, I take it, he wants to model the conscious, the unconscious and conscious ones, the thing that's in common between the conscious and unconscious ones. And then what
I see.
varies
Okay.
is the way you're aware of them. So
I
that if you
see.
have a peripheral experience and a foveal experience of the same quality may be there, it's just you're aware of it in different ways in those two cases.
Okay, yeah, that helps me understand better where you were coming from with that initial question about the conscious versus unconscious mental qualities. And I can see better now why you were thinking that, oh, maybe we need a different model of conscious mental qualities versus unconscious mental qualities. But let me say a bit to push back on that. I guess it seems to me that, yeah, I can see that way of thinking about the difference between conscious and unconscious mental qualities and the structure of conscious mental qualities. But I think another consideration is what kinds of functional role we actually associate with precision. And what I was thinking is that more precise experiences correspond to more fine-grained discriminatory capacities. So if you think about like your discriminatory capacities in foveal vision versus in peripheral vision, you're going to be able to make a lot more discriminations in foveal vision, and they'll be more fine-grained.
Can I just
And
interrupt you and ask, are you talking about conscious discrimination, like verbally reportable, or button pushing, or like what kind of discriminations are we talking about? J
what
and Ds?
I was thinking on any of these criteria, it's going to be more fine-grained in foveal vision than in peripheral vision. So I was thinking just pick whichever criterion you prefer, then we'll be able to, compare foveal and peripheral vision, and we'll get the result that there's this difference in discriminatory grain. And if we think of discriminatory grain as correlated with precision, then there's also going to be different levels of discriminatory grain when we're testing the unconscious mental qualities. So I guess that what that makes me think is that, okay, maybe there's a sense of awareness where you're only, whenever you're aware of a mental quality, you're conscious of that mental quality, and unconscious mental qualities are the ones that you're not aware of. But then I don't think that that sense of awareness is going to be the one that best corresponds to precision, because that sense of awareness is going to dissociate from the sense of awareness that that we have in mind when we're talking about fineness of grain of discriminatory capacities. And it seems to me that fineness of grain of discriminatory capacities, that's a better marker of precision than the notion of awareness that might demarcate conscious from unconscious mental qualities. So
Okay.
in effect, my thought is that even if you made this distinction that you're talking about that separates the conscious from unconscious mental qualities, there's still going to be this other dimension of variation that is going to better correspond to precision. That's going to be that's going to characterize the unconscious mental qualities as well.
So the idea would be that, because I know this is something that Rosenthal sort of explicitly commits himself to. I don't know about Austin, but definitely David. So that you could do just noticeable differences completely unconsciously and sort of map out the quality space of a creature without them being aware that they're being presented inequalities at all. You could sort of like ultra blindside, super blindside them in the limit and just say, here are two qualities are same or different. And they'd be like, I don't see anything. It's like, just guess. And they would say same or different or similar or not. And then you could kind of map out the space. And what you're saying then, as I hear you, is that if you did that, you expect that there would be precision differences at that level that aren't going to be captured by the way you're aware of the stimuli.
Yeah,
Or that's
or
quality, I'm sorry, the quality.
Yeah, or another way of putting it is I was thinking that we can think of the fineness of the J and Ds to just be an indicator of precision. And given that, we're going to be able to see how precise the unconscious mental qualities are as well, assuming this connection between precision and discriminatory grain, or precision and J and Ds. So this doesn't seem to me to motivate thinking that we need fundamentally different kinds of frameworks for modeling conscious mental qualities versus unconscious mental qualities, but instead, again, that they can be unified within a single framework where they are going to differ in where one systematic difference might just be that conscious mental qualities tend to be less precise and have more coarse-grained discriminatory capacities than unconscious mental qualities.
Right,
Although,
but how is that not captured on this model by the way you're aware of the quality? Maybe I'm missing what you just said. I might have missed it.
so I thought you were saying that the way you're aware of a quality, although it's something that comes in degrees, it always has degree 0 when we're talking about unconscious mental qualities.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that the degreed aspect of mental qualities that corresponds to precision, and that is something that we can measure through looking at fineness of discriminatory grain, is also going to be something that we can measure when we're looking at unconscious mental qualities by looking at the fineness of discriminatory grain for unconscious mental qualities. So if the way you're aware of a mental quality is something that is just always 0 when we're talking about unconscious mental qualities, then it seems like we're not going to just be able to talk about precision of unconscious mental qualities at all if we're thinking of the way you're aware of them as corresponding to precision. But unconscious mental qualities seem like they do have precision. So that means that what you're calling the way you're aware of a mental quality must be dissociable from what I'm calling precision.
Yeah. Okay, good. So what's the support for that premise that they seem to have precision in a way that goes beyond the way you're aware of them?
I guess I was thinking of it as sort of, so I think this is a premise you can attack, but it also seems plausible to me. I guess my thought is that when we think about conscious mental qualities, then it just seems extremely plausible that more precise mental qualities correspond to more fine-grained discriminatory capacities. So, I mean, the way I use the term precision is to denote a certain phenomenal property. It's the kind of phenomenal contrast between like foveal and peripheral color experiences, or like touching a surface with your hand versus with your back. Your tactile experience with your hand is more precise than your tactile experience with your back. So that's characterized phenomenally. But then we can ask what kind of functional properties are associated with this phenomenal property? What is the functional role of phenomenal precision? And my thought is that it's very plausible that the functional role of phenomenal precision is fineness of grain of discriminatory capacities. I mean, you can see this. I mean, part of the support is just that, when we do empirical investigation, it happens to be the case that the experiences that we call that I'm calling more precise tend to have more fine-grained discriminatory capacities. I think also if you just like think about your experience and think about when you're able to make sharper discriminations amongst external objects, it's going to be when you're experiencing them via the experiences that I'm calling precise. So that's the first premise, that there's for conscious mental qualities, precision is correlated with discriminatory grain. And then the second step, I guess, is the hypothesis that if there are other mental qualities that exhibit discriminatory grain, then we should think that that is also correlated with precision. So if there are unconscious mental qualities and those come in differing degrees of discriminatory grain, then we should think that the degree of discriminatory grain is at least evidence for degree of precision of those unconscious mental qualities.
Right. But doesn't the empirical work I was sort of alluding to earlier call into question the first claim? So there, the discriminatory grain doesn't track your conscious ability to distinguish them. In fact, you consciously say they look the same, but you're able nonetheless to differentiate them unconsciously.
Oh, okay. So now I see more why you were asking about which kind of measures of discriminatory grain I had in mind.
Yeah.
So in that circumstance, we'd have to be a bit more specific about what the measures are. And in that circumstance, I was thinking that on the relevant measure of discriminatory grain, you're not able to discriminate the two on the basis of it seems that you're not able to discriminate the two stimuli on the basis of your conscious experience in that circumstance. And that's going to be what's relevant for measuring the discriminatory grain of a conscious mental quality or of a set of conscious experiences.
Right. So you can't discriminate them, but it's very suggestive that there is some discriminatory capacity there, but not consciously accessible, so that the qualities that you're aware of are different, but you're aware of them as being the same. So that the two things there are distinct. And in fact, you can have behavioral evidence that you treating them as distinct. But nonetheless, the way you're aware of them seemingly is as the same, so that you consciously experience them as being the same quality, even though behaviorally they're distinguishable.
Well, so just to make sure that I'm understanding how you're thinking about this kind of case, are you thinking that the mental qualities in this scenario are conscious or are unconscious?
They're conscious, but not in a way that distinguishes them.
Sure. So the mental qualities are conscious. There are certain discriminatory capacities that you have in virtue of having these two different conscious experiences or these two different conscious mental qualities. And those are not fine-grained enough to distinguish between the different stimuli in this case. You have some other discriminatory capacities that you have in virtue of some other mental mechanism. And those are more fine-grained. So that all
I mean,
seems
one assumes that you could make the same discrimination even without being consciously aware of the qualities.
right.
So this is supposed to be evidence that the qualities are distinct. They're more, the precision is there, but not at the conscious level. And you were saying, go ahead. Sorry.
So is this, what is the claim that you're meaning to argue for in this case?
Well, the first premise, I mean, I guess one of the things that you said earlier was that your discriminatory ability tracks precision.
Mm-hmm.
And what I heard you saying was that your conscious discriminating ability tracks precision. But here's a case where it doesn't. Consciously, they seem the same, but yet they are discriminable, and you can discriminate them by behavioral methods, but not by a report or saying, they look the same or different.
I see. So, sorry. So I was wanting to have two premises. One is that conscious mental qualities are correlated with the precision of conscious mental qualities is correlated with the discriminatory grain of conscious mental qualities. And then the second premise was supposed to be linking precision, discriminatory grain to unconscious mental qualities, where the thought was that given that these two properties, precision, discriminatory grain, are correlated with conscious mental qualities, we should have as the default hypothesis that they're also correlated with unconscious mental qualities. So that's something that you could push back upon. But then the fact that if we grant that there are unconscious mental qualities whose degree of precision and discriminatory grain are finer than those of the associated conscious mental qualities, then that seems fine with me. I mean, that seems, I don't think that is incompatible with anything that I'm wanting to say. So I think I got a bit confused there because the stuff you were saying, it all sounded fine to me. So then I got confused about whether we were disagreeing about something or not.
Yeah, I see what you're saying now. But so what I was trying to push towards, and maybe we're not disagreeing here, but I was trying to suggest that there's a two-way dissociation between discrimination and mental quality. So there are cases where the same mental quality appears different, and cases where two different mental qualities appear the same. And so your ability to discriminate on the basis of consciousness disassociates from how precise they are, the qualities that you're aware of.
But then I think that we are somewhat speaking past each other, because I think that, to say it in your language, what I'm calling a mental quality is not just the mental quality that you're aware of, but also the way that you're aware of that mental quality. And if I'm getting your framework right, I think that what I'm calling precision just is the at least some aspect of the way that you're aware of a mental quality. It's like the degree of awareness that you have of that mental quality. I think that's what I'm calling precision when we're thinking
Yeah.
about conscious mental qualities, at least. Um, I mean, I should say as a general remark, this is to some extent, I think I'm thinking about all of this like conditionally, because as I said, I'm agnostic as to whether there are unconscious mental qualities or not. So then I'm sort of thinking about all this like, okay, let's suppose there are unconscious mental qualities. Then what should we think in this case, and what should we think in this case? But I guess my primary interest is just to capture the structure of the conscious mental qualities. So even if it turns out that we needed a different kind of framework for capturing unconscious mental qualities. I mean, that's largely okay with me. I think it's nice when, a single framework can extend to more phenomena. But the thing that I really want to target is just the structure of, the structure of the conscious mental qualities, but more generally, the structure of our conscious experiences.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, from the, I'm kind of on the fence about this, but I think if I were putting myself in the other side, I would wonder why the conscious mental qualities are the ones we want to model. When what we want are to get what we're aware of, and then the way in which we're aware of it. And so you can capture all the precision stuff in these two frameworks. One, what is it that we're aware of, and how precise are the differences that we can make there, distinctions that we can make, and then the way in which we're aware of it, sort of tacked on top. But I wonder why there's a primacy involved with the conscious stuff, because I mean, maybe this is again, on the Rosenthal model, the quality that you're aware of is conscious, but there's an aspect of it which is hidden from consciousness. Like you don't need to be aware of it in all of its glory. So these two qualities, which are distinct from each other, you could be aware of both of them as just the same quality. So then there's an aspect of it which is unconscious. There's a part of the state you're aware of which is excluded from consciousness. And that seems like an important thing that you want to capture if that's true. And there are other models too. I know Ned's view, even it's not exactly the same model, but it's a similar outcome where there's, every conscious experience has an unconscious aspects to it. I think that's similar. And you might even call that a deep structure to the conscious experience. I mean, so that might connect it to some of your other work that you've done. So, I mean, yeah, I wonder why we care more about the conscious things than the or the parts that are not conscious, the deeper, perhaps hidden aspects.
Well, I think the question of whether we should care more about the conscious things is going to depend on one's background theoretical commitments. So I'm inclined to think that there's a natural joint between the conscious and the unconscious, and that there's a whole lot of reason to focus on like the structure of consciousness in its own right, without thinking of it just as like a section of a bigger project on the structure of the mind. But that's just my own methodological background preference. If you think instead that no, we should be thinking about, say, mental qualities, and then some are going to be conscious, some are going to be unconscious, and whether they're conscious or not is going to depend on the degree to which we're aware of them, or whether we have any awareness of them, then yeah, from that kind of framework, the distinction between the conscious mental qualities and unconscious mental qualities is going to be less important than on the way that I'm thinking about it. But then I guess it seems to me like we should separate two questions. One is just whether the kind of formal framework that I articulate is going to capture an important aspect of the structure of conscious experiences on all of these views. And what I want to contend there is that, yeah, if you're David Rosenthal, or if you're Austin Clarke, or if you're Ned Block, or if you're whoever, you should find a lot of utility in this framework. But then when I say that that I'm interested in primarily in conscious mental qualities and more generally in the structure of conscious experiences themselves, that's not saying something about the the scope of the framework that I'm articulating, but instead just my own, I guess, research ambitions.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, I like all that. I agree with what you're saying, but it does sort of put pressure on the way you argue against the standard model, right? So you say quality space theories like Rosenthal's can't capture precision, therefore we need to move on, but they can, in this way that we're talking about, capture it. It requires a different theoretical outlook, and maybe a downplaying of the role of conscious experience and sort of focusing on the nature of the mind in general, and then consciousness comes along afterwards, something like that. But it does seem that the force of the argument against the traditional view depends on this background assumption that you have, that you were just articulating.
So maybe this is something where we are disagreeing, because I wanted to say that even if you adopt the kind of background framework that you were articulating for David Rosenthal, that there would still be problems in capturing precision. And part of why I was thinking that is I was agreeing with you that, okay, let's just take for granted that the structure of conscious experiences of mental qualities is there's a mental quality that's maximally specific, and then there's the way that we're aware of that mental quality. And that those two elements together explain the contrast between foveal color experience and peripheral color experience and all the other examples that I have. And in particular, when you're having the foveal color experience versus the peripheral color experience, you might be aware of the same quality. It's just that the way you're aware of it differs across those two cases. So then putting it in those terms, my question is, how do you capture the way that you're aware of aspect of conscious experiences with the standard model, where we're just using points in multidimensional spaces to capture the structure of mental qualities? So one danger here is that you might say, oh, by mental quality, I don't mean the way you're aware of the mental quality. I just mean the thing that you're aware of. I don't mean the thing that differs between foveal color experiences and peripheral color experiences. Instead, I mean the thing that remains constant across those two cases. And I agree. If that's what you're interested in modeling, then the standard model is going to be adequate given this theoretical framework that we're talking about. But that's just not the thing that I'm intending to model. Instead, the phenomena that I'm intending to model, to translate it within this framework, is the conjunction of the quality that you're aware of and the way you're aware of that quality. And what I want to contend is that there's no satisfying way to capture the way you're aware of that quality aspect within the standard framework.
Right. So that's why, I mean, to circle back around, that's why I suggested maybe you need a different account. So the way you're aware of it may be, you know, I mean, to take Rosenthal's own model, so maybe some intentional content, which sort of attributes to you a quality of a certain kind, can be either described specifically or generally. So you're not going to be using quality spaces in the same way to model the way you're aware of them. So it seems like there's an assumption built into what you're saying that you would expect there to be a quality space of a similar variety at the conscious level, which is why I said maybe your argument depends on some of the background assumptions you were making about what it is to be aware, what it means to be conscious.
I see. So maybe that does help better diagnose the fundamental point of disagreement here. So there's a question: what are quality space models supposed to be trying to capture in the first place?
Yeah.
And it sounds like what you're saying is, given a certain theoretical background, quality space models are not trying to capture what I'm calling precision at all. Instead, they're just trying to capture the qualities that we're aware of. Forget the way you're aware of aspect of consciousness. And I agree with you that I am presuming that quality space models ought to capture also the way you're aware of aspect of conscious experiences. To some extent, I think that's, you know, obviously there's some danger of a verbal issue there, but I think there's also, at least to some degree, a substantive question there. I think there's a question of what the natural kinds of consciousness or of the mind more generally are. And I guess it seems natural to me to think that if we're trying to model the kinds of experiences that we have in mind when we like talk about mental qualities and when we point to, different mental qualities and so forth, that we should be trying to capture the way you're aware of aspect of conscious experiences. Um, and that's part of what we ought to have in mind when we use the term mental quality, that that's like, if the term is going to latch onto like a natural joint, then that's like a very natural um, uh, kind for it to latch onto. But I think maybe that goes into like, these fairly fundamental questions that will be difficult to resolve. But yeah, I better see now why you were thinking that maybe I am sneaking in a certain theoretical assumption into the way that I'm arguing for things, and why I think we were talking past each other for a bit there.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. But and so there maybe is an argument here that you want the other thing and not your thing. So if you are able to discriminate in subliminal cases, so you say you're not aware of the thing, you're able to discriminate nonetheless. Blind sight's an example of that. But in normal subjects, that happens with masking and so forth, all that stuff we know about. So isn't there some pressure to say that it's the same thing in both cases? So you have a conscious experience of red, you have a subliminal experience of red. Shouldn't the same mental quality be involved in both of those, given
Well,
the psychological role they play in the mind and so forth? And doesn't that sort of push towards this idea that we want to model the mental qualities themselves as opposed to the way we're aware of them?
Well, I think I can capture this similarity in psychological role, because it's not like let's just talk about the conscious mental quality, let's talk about the conscious experience and the conscious mental quality and the unconscious mental quality. So it's not like they're just going to have no interesting relationship on the way that I'm suggesting we model them. Instead, probably what is going to be the case is that the conscious mental quality is going to be modeled by a relatively large region, and then the unconscious mental quality by a smaller region that is presumably contained within that larger region. So I think that we can capture the similarity of psychological role within the kind of regional framework that I'm advocating for, even if we extend it to unconscious mental qualities as well.
Yeah. And
Although
so you
more
don't
broadly,
go ahead.
just going back to the question of whether this is verbal, let's suppose we just grant that we're going to use the term mental quality in a way in the way that you're suggesting, where it factors out the way you're aware of a quality. It's just the maximally specific quality that we're aware of. Then, if we were to assume this, I agree that the standard framework for modeling mental qualities would be representationally adequate, given its limited scope. But then my thought is that, well, then we can augment it and expand it and capture not only the qualities that we're aware of, but also the way that we're aware of those mental qualities. And this is another, systemic and interesting aspect of conscious experiences and of our mental life. And now we have this, new framework that can do more than the old framework. Maybe the old framework wasn't structurally inadequate. Maybe it was just limited in its scope, and that's
Yeah.
fine. But now here's a new framework that has wider scope.
Yeah, I guess my worry about that move there is that there seems to be an assumption that the thing there is phenomenally conscious in both cases, because otherwise you won't be able to capture that aspect of it by just expanding the regions. So in the subliminal case, it looks like you're committed to something like overflow, right? That's that the quality, if there's something that it's like for you to have the quality, you don't know what it's like or something like that. Otherwise, when you move to the conscious case and expand to the region, you're not adding any, there's no phenomenal character that a region provides. So the same things are there, it's just a set of points. The points either have phenomenal character on their own or they don't. So expanding to the region doesn't add that. Whereas on the other view, the subliminal one, there's nothing that it's like for you to have it. It's qualitative, but you're not aware of it. Then the way in which you're aware of it determines what it's like for you to have it. And so you need a separate apparatus to explain where the what it's like part comes from, the phenomenal character. And that's not included in the thing that you were just mentioning. So it looks like you would be committed again to a certain theoretical framework, smuggling an assumption about the nature of consciousness into it.
I'm not sure I followed that point. So could you say more about why you're thinking that? Yeah, could you re-articulate the point? I'm not sure what
Yeah.
the
So
issue.
in the subliminal case, you show someone red, you ask them, did they see it? They say no. But you can show that they were aware of it in some sense because they're primed or whatever, just some behavioral criteria by which you can say, okay, so there was a processing in the mind, in the brain. So there's a mental quality there, one might say, but there's nothing that it's like for you to have that mental quality. So that's one thing. So then you consciously see the red. There is something that it's like for you to have that experience. So the difference there is in terms of, the same quality, one is consciously experienced, the other one is not. And that distinction doesn't seem to me to be captured by expanding from a point to a region.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. So if in order to capture whatever the relevant differences from when we move from unconscious to conscious mental qualities, you're going to have to go beyond the framework that I articulated.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think even if you assume that, I think even if you just like exclude the possibility of unconscious mental qualities, let's say you think that all mental qualities are conscious, it's still going to be the case that the framework I'm articulating doesn't tell you why, like, mental phenomenon with this kind of structure should be conscious. So that's just something that lies outside the scope of the framework. So I agree with that. I think that that's not just an issue if, I don't think that that's an issue. I think that's just something that is not within the ambition of the framework, and presumably will be something that requires some other.
So I guess I misunderstood what you were saying then, Andrew, because I thought you were saying that you could capture the difference between the unconscious and the conscious one by expanding from a point to a region. But maybe what you're simply saying is that you could capture the precision difference or something like that. Yeah. So that the conscious one is less precise than the unconscious one. That's going to be modeled by the region as opposed to the point.
That's what I was intending to say.
Okay, but the actual consciousness part of it, whatever renders it conscious, whatever the difference is between the conscious and unconscious one, in virtue of which is conscious, that's not captured. So you would agree you would need something else on this model.
That's right. And I think that this relates to the things I was saying about the flexibility and neutrality of the framework, because one of my goals is to, one of my goals here is to have the framework that I develop be compatible with a wide range of philosophical views. So no matter what kind of, almost no matter what kind of like theoretical philosophical commitments you have about consciousness, you can be on board with this framework, and it'll have various kinds of theoretical benefits. If, on the other hand, we were thinking about a kind of framework for understanding the divide between the conscious and the unconscious, it's very hard to imagine how you could have a fairly theory neutral framework there, because there's all sorts of different theories of consciousness, and they have like radically different extensional predictions. So yeah.
So can I circle back around to the bat? Because this does make me worry a little bit about the bat and your claim about the objective phenomenology. Because it sounds like what you're saying is that we can't read off the phenomenal character from the quality space, even once we switch to the regions. So even if we had some kind of structure of the bat's quality space, it wouldn't be telling us about its conscious necessarily quality space. It might just be telling us about unconscious. So there'd be no real reason to think of it as an objective phenomenology as opposed to an objective quality space that's not conscious with no phenomenology.
Sure. So I think that's what you said is right. But I was thinking of the relevant structural facts in a slightly different way. I was thinking that we were just given the information that the relevant formal structure that we're looking at characterizes the phenomenology of bad experiences. So if all I tell you is that, hey, minds have, they instantiate this kind of structure. That wouldn't necessarily tell you anything about bat phenomenology, because for all you know, it might be a non-phenomenal aspect of
Right.
bat minds. But if instead I tell you, hey, the echolocation experiences of bats, which have phenomenology, can be characterized in this way, they have this kind of formal structure, then I think that would tell you something about bat phenomenology. So I was presuming that
what would it tell us though? I mean, so I sorry to interrupt you, but I think I understand what you're saying, is that we're sort of assuming that it's conscious phenomenology that we're modeling in the first place. That's why we get some hold on the structure of it. But I mean, one of the puzzles for me about the bat case is, you know, I teach introduction to neuroscience, and so I talk about this a little bit there. But anyway, so it's not clear whether bat echolocation should be modeled as vision or hearing. So clearly the sound waves are entering, you know, through their ears and connected to what we would call auditory cortex in the bat brain, but we label it auditory cortex because it's connected to the ears. There's no real evidence that they are hearing where things are as opposed to seeing them. They could be having visual experiences. I mean, it's kind of surprising that our visual experiences are connected to light waves. You know, you wouldn't have thought that, I expect, from beforehand. So why couldn't their visual experiences be connected to what we call auditory waves? And that's sort of the whole point of the bat, of what it's like to be the bat. And the problem there is that we can't know even those basic facts about whether they're seeing or hearing, given all complete model of their brain. So even if you did sort of give me this account and say, well, here's the structure of that, I still wouldn't know if it's visual experience or auditory experience. Do you disagree with that?
No, I agree with you. I don't think that knowing the structure of an experience tells you everything about the experience. I think, in fact, it leaves out the aspect of experience that philosophers spend all their time, you know, thinking about. And I think that's obviously a very important aspect, that, you know, that's one of the main things we're interested in. But I do think that knowing the structure of an experience tells you some things about the phenomenology of an experience, and it gives a way of characterizing the phenomenal character of an experience, that is understandable no matter what kind of experiential system the understander has. But basically, I agree with you that there's going to be limits to what can be gleaned from purely structural information about an experience.
Okay. So this doesn't, so I mean, because part of what Nagel was doing in that article at the end, where I take it your inspiration sort of comes from that he says, if only somebody would do this. And you said, well, I will try a little bit. So part of what he was suggesting there was that we need these concepts in order to understand how physicalism could be true, what it would mean for consciousness to be physical. We would need some way to connect the objective structure to physical structures. And I can see how if you have this model, you could connect the structural elements to some physical attributes in the bat's brain, but it wouldn't solve any of these problems, the deep pressing problems about consciousness being physical or not, right? You agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. And so do you take a kind of pessimistic view then that that's not in principle possible, or to fulfill the hope of the Nagel of Thomas, that we could give an objective phenomenology in such a way that we could understand the connection? So is this the limit, you think, or do you think that maybe we could bridge it further and actually start to get some grasp on what it's like really to be a bat, as opposed to just these structural features? This is a speculative question. I know you haven't worked on this. I'm just curious what you think.
Well, I feel like there's one way of understanding the question where it's, can this further part of the Nagel article that you mentioned be satisfied? Namely, is there a way of developing an objective phenomenology such that doing so would solve the mind-body problem? And that I'm inclined to say no. I think that at least if you think of I mean, there's a question of what objective phenomenology even means, but the way I think of it is developing a way of characterizing phenomenal character that's understandable even by creatures that don't have the experiences under question.
Right.
And I think that that's possible. I think that that's limited because I don't think that there's a way of doing so that can capture all aspects of phenomenal character. But I think that, you know, as we've been discussing, if you describe the structure of an experience, then you'll be describing some aspects of an experience. But for this extended project of solving the mind-body problem, I guess it doesn't seem to me that engaging in this kind of project will really solve that issue. I agree with you that it might help us with uh, somewhat more tractable issues. For example, if we want to understand what the physical correlates of consciousness are and investigate that, then one of the components of that will be to understand what kinds of structure the relevant conscious experiences have, and then to look for physical phenomena with similar structures to try to produce the links. But that still leaves open what the metaphysical relationship is between between consciousness and the physical world. If there was, I felt like another way of understanding your question, though, where it was just more broadly, do I think there's a way of resolving the mind-body problem? Or am
Yeah.
I just like agnostic on that? And there, I guess my answer is yes. I'm pretty sympathetic to Russellian monism.
Oh,
And in fact, part of why I started thinking about the structure of experience is when I was first getting interested in consciousness, I was very interested in the metaphysical nature of consciousness and in traditional issues about the mind-body problem. And I was really puzzled for a long time. And I went through like a physicalist phase and I went through a dualist phase. And I thought like all these positions are deeply problematic and none of them is satisfactory. And it seems like the space of options is exhausted. And then I thought about it more and I realized that I think Russellian monism actually provides a pretty plausible solution. And then I thought, okay, well, I guess that's solved. What else is there to think about? I should like start working on some other stuff. So yeah, that's sort of like the background story of how I came to start thinking about the issues that I'm interested in.
cool. That's interesting. I wonder, so since you brought that up, I wonder if there's some way of connecting this issue up to what our discussion we've been having that maybe put pressure on some of the things that you're saying. So Russellian monism, first of all, can you tell me what you mean by that, since there are many different versions of it? So which version are you most sympathetic to, and how do you understand that claim?
I'm pretty agnostic about different versions of it. I mean, I guess I think of it as the thesis that physical sciences tell us only about structural properties of the world, and that the things in the world have more than just structure, and that the extra structural properties of the things in the world will play a significant role in explaining consciousness. I mean, I should say this isn't something that I've worked on myself, and it's not really something I think of as part of my research program, but
Right.
it's
Well,
more
you
sort
offer
of
it as an example of a view where there would be deep structure, a microstructure to experience or something like that.
sure,
Right?
yeah.
And so let's suppose that we take because there are different versions of, so you could have pan-proto-psychism, you could have even a Russellian kind of physicalism, like Barbara Montero's view. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she thinks maybe those properties are physical, but nonetheless, they go beyond the structural. Anyway, so there's lots of different ways of fleshing it out. But let's suppose that they're conscious, that the non-structural properties, the quiddities, whatever you want to call them, let's suppose that they're consciousness, phenomenal properties. You can't capture their structure in the kind of model that you're presenting, can you?
You mean the structure of the fundamental quiddities, to put it in that
Yeah.
language?
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that that they wouldn't have any structure, that they would just be symbols. But
But
maybe
they would
I was
have
misunderstanding. Maybe I was misunderstanding how you were thinking about this.
well, I'm just going off what we talked about earlier. I was using structure in a very loose sense to say that they would be similarity relations between them.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I don't mean structural in the sense of physics like we were talking about. So I'm sorry, yeah, I was being ambiguous there. But just that there are, so to take a version of it, so suppose that the fundamental properties that we call charge, etc., mass, really are phenomenal properties and they're non-structural elements. There still should be similarity relations. Maybe, the experience of that charge is identical to is going to be dissimilar to the experience that mass is identical to. And so you can kind of map out their similarities in that way, but the kind of region quality space model we've been talking about is silent on that. Is that correct? Or, but it's still
Yeah,
a
I think
conscious
that's right.
experience, so it's going to be missing out on a large part of conscious experience.
I think that's right. I mean, presumably, if fundamental particles have phenomenal properties, then they'll have very simple phenomenal properties, and those phenomenal, the experiences associated with those entities won't have very much structure. Uh, they might still have some structure. Maybe they have similarity structure. Maybe, we can think about the similarity relations between, say, mass and charge, or between like photons and neutrons. Uh, but yeah, presumably there won't be that much structure there if there is any.
So you mean when you say there's not that much structure, you're saying there are not going to be similarity relations, difference relations between them. I mean, I find so they're going to be all the same.
No, I was thinking that there might be similarity relations, or maybe they're just fundamentally different. Maybe there's no way of putting them all into a single quality space that where there will be any interesting relations. Maybe it'll
I
just
see.
be, like a totally disconnected space that where there is no uh, interesting distance relations at all.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So then to sort of round this up, then the quality space model that you want to present is confined to macro phenomenal properties.
Yeah, so I'm not really thinking about. I mean, I think that's all. Thinking about the phenomenal properties of fundamental particles is all, obviously quite speculative, and I'm agnostic on panpsychism myself. Um, but most of what I'm thinking about are the kinds of experiences that, uh, I guess my starting point is to think about the kinds of experiences that humans have, and then to generalize and to think about the space of experiences more broadly.
Yeah. So there's no hope for, because I was thinking, maybe there's a possible solution to the combination problem or something that we could milk out of this, but there's no connection that you can get between the micro and macro from this model, at least.
You mean from the framework that I developed for mental qualities?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's very much connection there. I mean, there's a question. I see. Maybe I'm better understanding where you were coming from now. So there's a question of whether that framework has any applicability to. Uh, so there's a question of, if we suppose panpsychism is true, whether the framework has any applicability to the experiences of, say, like neutrons and photons and stuff. And I think it's not very obvious what to think there. I mean, that's not something I've thought about very much. Mostly I'm thinking about the kinds of color experiences and mental qualities that humans have. And my thought is that, hey, there's some structural features of these experiences that aren't capturable by the standard ways that we use to model those experiences. And if you do capture them in the most natural way, then you also get all these theoretical benefits. But then there's a question: how far does this new framework actually extend? Does it apply to all possible mental qualities? Do all conscious experiences actually even instantiate mental qualities, or are there non-qualitative? Are there conscious experiences that don't involve any mental qualities in the sense that we're talking about here? And those are things that I'm not sure what to think about, that I'm mostly agnostic about.
Okay. Yeah. So another example that you give of experience with possible deep structure is like pain asymbolia. Um, is the quality space model you're talking about here going to be applicable to things like that? So if we go
There's
away from.
Yeah, so there's an interesting question about how we should model pain experiences and how we should model valence. And that's also something I'm not sure about. So one way you could think about it is that, what we should conclude from pain asymbolia is that pain experience has two different dimensions: the affective dimension and the sensory dimension. So the quality space for pain experiences is going to have a two-dimensional structure where there's like one magnitude, sensory intensity, and another magnitude, like negative affect, and any pain experience will be will lie somewhere within that space. I guess one thing I'm not sure about is whether we should think of negative affect or more generally valence experience, experiencing something as good or bad or in a positive way or a negative way, as just corresponding to another dimension of our quality space models, or whether it should be modeled in some other way. There is an interesting connection to the stuff we were talking about earlier concerning precision, because one of the things that I want to argue for is that precision isn't just another, random feature of conscious experiences. Instead, it's a basic structural feature of experience that requires basic structural changes to our formal frameworks in order to capture, and that any domain of mental qualities is going to have precision structure if you accept the kind of approach that I'm taking. So that has implications here, because if we think of valence as another dimension of mental qualities, if pain experience has that kind of two-dimensional structure we just talked about, then presumably there should be imprecision with respect to the affective dimension of valence experience. Right. And it's hard to imagine what that would be. It's not clear that that's possible. At least it seems less clear that that's possible than when we're thinking about, more prosaic dimensions of mental qualities like hue or sensory intensity and so forth. So I think that's one interesting connection. That's something that leaves me uncertain. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I noticed. Okay. So I could be asking you a million questions, but there's a whole other side of your work I want to make sure that we get to, and I can't keep you forever. Obviously, you have better things to do, like watering that cool plant in the background. But I want to ask you about your work on value and life and consciousness, which I think is really interesting and cool. So you have a couple of papers on this where you argue basically for what I consider to be like twin theses. They're not the same, obviously, but they're related in a way. So one is that life in general, life itself is neutral. It's not good to be alive. It's not bad to be alive. Depends on what happens in your life, and so to speak. And the same thesis sort of you argue with respect to consciousness. Consciousness doesn't have intrinsic value. It's kind of neutral. It's the conscious experiences that are good or bad, but consciousness all by itself is neutral. So I mean, before I get into the arguments, like your argument zero and all the interesting things that you bring up here, do you think these two theses are related? Are they distinct? Do you see an interesting connection between life and consciousness, or do you think that these are orthogonal?
I think these are basically the same thesis. So, okay. I mean, what I mean by life is the kind of thing that people have in mind when they talk about welfare or well-being. Yeah. So when we talk about things going good or bad for some entity or something having a life worth living, then that's the notion I have in mind when I talk about life. And one hypothesis, which I accept, is that what it is to have a life, in other words, what it is to be a welfare subject, what it is to be the kind of thing for which things can go better or worse for you, is to be conscious. So I think that those are equivalent theses. I mean, that's a substantive position, but that's one that I in fact endorse. So in that respect, I think that those two papers that you mentioned are both arguing for the same thesis, though in different ways. Right.
So a human and a chicken, they have a life, but a plant doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously a plant has a life in the biological sense, but I don't, in my view, plants are not the kinds of things that have welfare values, where a plant is not the kind of thing that has a life that can be worth living or not worth living.
Right. And so the same would be true about like philosophical zombies.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So that's what I was sort of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just going to say that's another aspect of my view, my overall view on consciousness and value. Because as you said, I think that consciousness itself is neutral, meaning that I don't think in virtue of being conscious, one is better off or worse off. But I also think that consciousness is what makes an entity a welfare subject. So I think it's in virtue of being conscious that an entity is the kind of thing that can be doing better or worse.
And just so we're clear here, we mean phenomenal consciousness. So suppose that you could distinguish phenomenal consciousness from creature consciousness, like some people do, so that you could be creature conscious but not phenomenal conscious. then you would say only the phenomenally conscious one has a life, but not the creature conscious one.
So by phenomenal consciousness here, you mean what people call state consciousness? Like, do you mean
There being
like being
something
in
that it's like for you generally?
at that time?
Yeah.
Whereas you're thinking of creature consciousness as being dispositionally characterized, where even if you're asleep, you're still creature conscious, but you're not phenomenally conscious at that time. Just to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah, I wasn't quite thinking of it that's a good way of thinking about it. But what I was thinking was that it's possible that you could have creature consciousness without any phenomenal consciousness, even when you're awake, because creature consciousness may be characterized in terms of just being informationally sensitive to the environment. I mean, so for the way I think about it, a plant is creature conscious. It's sensitive to the environment, but it's not phenomenally conscious. A Roomba is creature conscious. It can navigate the environment, the robotic vacuum, I mean. It can navigate the environment and so forth. So it's aware in some sense of its environment, but not phenomenally. So not everyone wants to separate those two notions, but some people do. So I was just wondering what you would say about the Roombas.
I see. Okay, I see. I'm glad I asked, because I was using the term creature conscious in a different way.
So that they have phenomenal conscious disposition to have it, right?
Right. So is the way you're thinking of creature consciousness basically the same as access consciousness? Is what it is to be creature conscious, to be access conscious in your terminology?
Close enough, yeah.
Yeah, so in that case, I'm thinking of everything I was saying before is meant to apply to phenomenal consciousness, not access or creature consciousness.
Yeah.
Maybe could we use access consciousness, because I'm a bit more comfortable with that kind of terminology, because I think of creature consciousness as meaning something else from both of these things.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the way it was introduced by, I think Rosenthal is the one who introduced that term, and that's the way he introduced it. But it's come to mean, I understand people use it in different ways now. So that's fine. So we could use access conscious in that way. So a creature that was just access conscious wouldn't be subject of a life or have welfare or anything like that, on your view.
Yeah.
So and in that respect, the super blindsider is out.
Well, the super blindsider, I thought that as it was originally introduced, the super blindsider is conscious. They just don't have visual experiences.
Right. They might have cognitive states that are conscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
right.
Like emotions.
The super duper blindsider.
Well, so basically a zombie, right? So yes. One of the consequences of my view is that zombies are not welfare subjects. They're not the kinds of things that have lives or have lives that can be worth living or not, or can be doing better.
So just to connect this up, because I know, so for Dave Chalmers' view about Vulcans, the Vulcans have conscious experiences, but they lack affect and stuff like that. They are subjects of life on your view? They matter?
Vulcans, I think, are defined as being conscious, right? So yeah, so Vulcans would count as welfare subjects on my view.
Okay, good. I just wanted to be clear about what the thesis was. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you give us a little, can you tell us about argument 0? Why should we think that it's neutral? I mean, so first of all, you rule out antinatalism, I think, right? So the idea that it's overall bad to be born, you sort of dismiss that as, that's not the thing you don't even consider that, right?
Well, antinatalism is a little bit different from what I was calling the negative view. So if antinatalism is the thesis that it's bad to be born, that's related to, but distinct from, the thesis that consciousness itself is bad. But one thing I am just presuming is false is that consciousness itself is bad. I'm not sure if anybody.
So that's the negative view. I see. Yeah. Okay.
So if you think that consciousness itself is bad, you could think that some lives are still worth living, because maybe consciousness itself is bad, but you have like all these good experiences and other good things in your life, and that makes your life overall worth living, despite the fact that. But that's a very bizarre view. I'm not sure if anybody has actually endorsed it.
Yeah, exactly. Consciousness sucks, but pleasure's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I was confused about the relation to antinatalism. Before we get started, do you have a view about whether it's better to have not existed generally, or does something about that fall out of your view, do you think, or are you neutral on that?
Um, Puzzles about existence are, I think, very difficult, and I'm mostly neutral on this. I do think that, so one of the things that I'm arguing for is that life itself is neutral, which on my view is the same as saying consciousness itself is neutral. One thing I think is that that doesn't have direct implications for debates in normative ethics about what is called the value of existence. So this is kind of confusing terminology because the sense, the issue that people are talking about when they talk about the value of existence is different from the issue that I'm talking about here. The issue there is not whether existence itself is good, but instead whether we can make comparisons between situations where a person exists versus situations where they don't exist. So that's sort of an issue I don't have any stance on, and I don't think that anything I've argued for has direct implications for.
Okay, good. I'm glad I asked that to clarify. Okay, so I mean, part of the argument for argument zero is that you contrast these various kinds of cases. So what you call paradise, swift hell. Can you tell us a little bit about these cases and how you use them?
Yeah, I mean, the general idea is that the argument for zero is the name I use for the general argument that I have against the view that life itself is valuable, and for the view that life itself is neutral. And the basic idea behind the argument is that if you think that life itself is valuable, then, or let's put it in terms of consciousness, since this is, a consciousness podcast. So if you think that
Absolutely.
consciousness itself is valuable, then there's a question: how does the value due to consciousness itself scale with the amount of consciousness, which presumably is just a function of how long somebody is conscious? So, for example, one view you could have is that the more consciousness there is, the more value. So, somebody who lives like 100 years gets a lot more value just in virtue of being conscious than somebody who just lives 1 year. Another view you could have is that it's just constant, that as long as you're conscious for even a second, then you get all of the value associated with consciousness itself. And it doesn't matter how long you live. And what I want to argue is that no matter how you think about the function from the quantity of consciousness to the amount of value generated by consciousness, you're going to be faced with some implausible results. And the simple way of seeing it, the simple version of the argument is, let's suppose you think that the relationship is linear. So the more consciousness you have, the more value generated by consciousness. Well, then imagine a creature that is conscious and that lives forever, but that has no good experiences and no bad experiences, and that has nothing good or bad in its life. It doesn't have any like knowledge or achievements or anything like that. It's just like this very neutral creature that, say, just has experiences of gray. Now, if you think that the more consciousness, the more value, and that this is a linear relationship, then you're going to have to think that this creature who just lives forever has an overall better life than even the best lives of that humans have ever lived. And that just seems super implausible to me. It seems to me that, well, clearly, a good human life is better than this neutral but really long life. Then on the other
I mean,
hand, if
you might have to say they have infinite value, right? If they live forever.
yeah,
The
the
scale's
infinite
linear.
thing is not really, if they live forever, then you'd have to say they have infinite value. I mean, we could also just consider a really long life if somebody is uncomfortable with thinking about infinitary value. So just
Yeah.
imagine that the creature lives for like 10 trillion years or something, however long it is that's needed to outweigh the value generated by a good human life. So that's one horn of the dilemma. The other horn is, if, let's say, you instead think that the value of consciousness itself is constant, and that as long as you are conscious at all, then you get all of the value associated with consciousness. And the value associated with consciousness is finite. So then you can't run this first scenario that I just articulated to argue against the view. Well, then there's another scenario. This is the scenario that I call swift hell, where imagine a creature that lives for just a few seconds, or let's say a few minutes, and is just tortured that entire time. So it has a horrible, horrible life during its entire existence. If the value of consciousness is constant, and if we suppose that it's large enough that it makes a difference to our lives, then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take all of the value that is associated with, that's generated by consciousness, and weigh that against the value, all the disvalue that comes from the torturous experiences that this creature in Swift Hell experiences. And unless the value associated with consciousness is just really small, so small that it presumably can't make any significant impact on lives of human length, then you're going to get the results that a creature that just lives for a few minutes and just undergoes torturous pain has a life worth living. Because even though it has all this disvalue associated with these negative experiences, well, it was still conscious, and it gets all of the value from consciousness at once. So it, is above zero on the scale of the value of life. And then the general idea is that these are just two extreme versions of the argument of the dilemma. But I think that no matter what you think the function from the quantity of consciousness to the value generated by consciousness looks like, you're going to be faced with some version of this dilemma and some result that is implausible.
So the basic idea is, if consciousness itself is valuable, then one of these two things you have to endorse as being valuable as well. But it's just wildly implausible that these things should be endorsed. Therefore, modus tollens is not valuable.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
And depending on how you do it, you can make one result more mild. But for example, one of the views that I consider is an asymptotic view, where the value of consciousness itself is an asymptote. It starts off increasing a lot, but then it levels off. But I think even then you're going to be faced with some milder version of one of these two horns of a dilemma.
So I wonder what you were going to say if we change comparison classes slightly. So take the really boring life of infinite gray, and they don't even like gray. They don't like it. They don't dislike it. They just gray and they're blah about it the entire time. Mm-hmm. If we compare that with infinite zombiehood, then isn't the boring life better? And does that not put some pressure on in the opposite direction?
Yeah, I guess I want to say that they're the same. I mean, I think for one thing, we should be kind of, I guess speaking for myself, I'm generally wary of putting too much weight on intuitions about cases. But in this case, I guess I'm inclined to think that, there's certainly, it's certainly not obvious that the zombie life would be better than the eternity life that I articulated.
Right, but
sorry, that the eternity life would be better than the zombie life.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, because, well, by definition, the boring life, the eternity life, is that person is subject to welfare. They're a welfare subject, but the zombie is not. And yet you're suggesting that they're equivalent with respect to their value. I don't know. I find that puzzling. I guess my intuition just goes in the other way. It seems like the eternity is better. I'd rather be in that scenario than the zombie, because with respect to the zombie, you lose everything. But with respect to the eternity, you have something. I mean, it's not the most. So maybe it's just because gray is non-neutral. I mean, yeah, it's positive. I don't know. Maybe I'm conflating, because it's really hard, as you say in your paper, to isolate just consciousness. There's always some experience, and so there's always going to be maybe some value associated with the experience. So maybe I'm getting hung up on that in my thinking right now. But
I mean, also with that comparison that you just made, different people are going to go different ways. So you just articulated a preference for having the life of the eternity creature, but other people are going to articulate a preference for having the zombie life. If you think that For example, things like achievements and knowledge are valuable for the person that has them, and that it's possible to achieve things or to know things even in the absence of consciousness. Then you might be a person who thinks that, oh, of course, I'd rather be a zombie than to be this like simple creature that just has experiences of gray. So I guess it seems to me like this thought experiment is. I don't think there's going to be like clear-cut intuitions either way in this case.
Yeah. I mean, eternity guy person, they have achievements. They achieved experience of gray for a long time.
Well, it depends on what you mean by achievement. But I think in the sense of achievement, where some people think that achievements are valuable, I think people
Yeah.
might.
So is part of the stipulation for eternity that they have no other states, so they don't have any beliefs, desires, or it's just experience of gray for eternity?
They have no welfare goods or bads. So how you flesh it out will depend on how you want to think about what the welfare goods and bads are. But if we just appeal to the most common views about welfare, then we can take for granted that the creature in eternity does not have any desires satisfied or frustrated, does not have any knowledge or friends or achievements, and does not have any pleasures or pains.
Right. And so there are really people who are going to prefer the zombie life. Zombiehood just seems like the absence of everything that's important. I mean, there's, I mean, I guess it's part of the view you're arguing against. I don't have an argument against it. I just find it very implausible. But so there are some people who say consciousness is what makes life worth living. And you're suggesting, no, there could be other things that make life worth living. Or not even life, just, I mean, the zombies don't have a life on your view, but nonetheless, it's better to be them than the really boring life.
So I want to be careful here. So when you say consciousness, or when somebody says consciousness is what makes life worth living, I think there's a number of things that they might mean. So one way of interpreting that is that consciousness itself is valuable. That's what I'm arguing against. Another way of interpreting this, or another way of understanding what they might have in mind, is that consciousness is what makes an entity a welfare subject. That's something I endorse. So yeah. I think consciousness itself is neutral, but I think consciousness is what you can think of it as. Consciousness is what gives something the status of being the kind of thing that can be better or worse off in the first place. And then another thing that people might mean is that consciousness is what is a precondition for something to be a welfare good or a welfare bad. That's a thesis that is sometimes called experientialism in the welfare literature. That's the view that only conscious experiences can be good or bad for the possessor of them. And that's something that's independent from both of these theses that we were just talking about. It's independent from the welfare subjects thesis, and it's independent from the thesis that consciousness is intrinsically valuable. But this third thesis, experientialism, is also something that I endorse. So I think that only conscious experiences make one better or worse off. And this is something that you could agree with me that consciousness is what makes something a welfare subject, while rejecting experientialism. For example, you might think that it's only conscious subjects that can be better or worse off, but there are some things that have nothing to do with consciousness that can make you better or worse off. Maybe like, maybe like knowledge, it's externally individuated, and whether you know something is going to depend on more than just like your internal states. And you might think that knowledge is something that makes you better or worse off. And it matters whether you have knowledge or merely justified belief. So that's one way in which you might accept the role of consciousness in a theory of welfare subjects, but deny it in a theory of welfare goods. But I want to say that consciousness lies at the center of both of those things, that it's the precondition for both welfare subjecthood and for welfare goods.
Yeah. So can I ask about particular experiences? So with respect to pain, do you is it on your view pain? Obviously pain is bad, but is it intrinsically bad? Or is it only instrumentally bad? And if it's intrinsically bad, in virtue of what? If the affect, is that the thing that qualifies it?
It's intrinsically bad. No, it's intrinsically bad in virtue of how it feels. it's not intrinsically bad simply in virtue of being conscious, but it's intrinsically bad in virtue of its phenomenal character. So when I say that consciousness itself is neutral, that just means that consciousness itself, independent of the specific character of experience, adds no value or disvalue. But I think that all sorts of experiences are in fact valuable or disvaluable. I think that pleasures are good and pains are bad. Pleasures are intrinsically good and pains are intrinsically bad. And that this is because of the way pleasures feel and the way pains feel.
So conscious pains are intrinsically bad.
Yeah.
So if there were unconscious pains, they wouldn't be bad or good?
Yeah, I think they would be neutral.
Really? Okay, interesting.
I mean, they would probably be instrumentally bad. But I think that if they made no difference to your total set of conscious experiences over the course of your whole life, then they would make no difference to your welfare.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be worse off for having an unconscious pain.
Yeah.
So, you know, the old thought experiment, would you have surgery by taking the memory drug, which you had all the pains but just forgot about it, versus having the pain eradicated completely? So having just unconscious pains versus having conscious pains but forgetting about them. You're going to say in the latter case, something bad has happened to you, but in the former case, nothing bad has happened.
Wait, sorry. The former case is where you forget?
No, you have unconscious pains.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that makes a big difference whether you had them consciously and forgot about them or whether they were just unconscious.
Okay. I mean, it's hard. It seems to me that like you're going to hit some kind of fundamental wall here with respect to intuition. So how do we give an argument that's going to get around? Like, for instance, I think it's intrinsically bad to have the unconscious pains. I think probably it's just as bad. But what argument could you give that would convince someone like me or me convince someone like you? So it sounds, you said you don't like to appeal to cases or intuitions too much, but at this level, what else is there?
Yeah, so I mean, this gets into my broader views on consciousness and value. I'm inclined to think that the meta ethics of consciousness is special in that we have special justification for our value beliefs about experiences that does not apply to other kinds of evaluative or normative beliefs. More specifically, I think that beliefs like the belief in the proposition that pain is bad are more justified than the other kinds of beliefs about how we ought to act or whether some non-conscious thing is bad. And I think the reason for this is that the belief that pain is bad or that pleasure is good or take any other kind of experience that you think is bad or good comes not just from our intuitions, but also from our grasp of the phenomenal character of the relevant experiences. So I think that it's in virtue of knowing how pain feels that we're justified in believing that pain is bad, and that anybody who knows how pain feels has full justification, is rationally compelled to think, is in a position to know, can a priori deduce that pain is bad, and that this doesn't apply to other kinds of ethical facts that are not value facts about experiences. I have a number of arguments for why this is the case. I think it's also useful here to compare this meta-ethical view I just articulated to some neighboring views. For example, phenomenal intentionality, phenomenal conservatism, and the phenomenal powers view. These are all views that take there to be intentional or epistemic or causal powers facts that are justified, that we are in a position to know on the basis of knowing what the relevant experiences feel like. So I think similarly, in virtue of knowing what it feels like to have certain experiences, we're in a position to know certain value facts about those experiences. And I mean, this is sort of the meta-ethical background, but I think this is one way in which we can develop the foundations for a realist meta-ethical view. that doesn't that doesn't appeal to intuitions, and that makes our knowledge of ethical facts non-mysterious, at least insofar as, knowledge of uh, intentional or epistemic or causal powers facts are non-mysterious under
Yeah.
the analogous views.
I mean, you still might have deontological facts that are mysterious. Like, why is it good to keep a promise?
Yeah. So I think that the same kinds of meta-ethical puzzles still remain for these other kinds of ethical facts. But I think there's, and I'm not saying anything about whether we should, be anti-realist or realist in these other domains. But I think that if we're concerned with value facts about experiences, there's a special source of justification for our value beliefs in those facts. And this source does not come from intuition. And this is a way of justifying certain beliefs, certain kinds of ethical beliefs, without merely appeal to intuitions about cases.
Yeah, I mean, I like all that. And I'm a value realist myself. I wrote my dissertation on this, actually. But anyway, no one cares. But
I didn't know that.
I wrote my meta ethics is how I started, and then I switched to consciousness. But anyway, so what's puzzling me about what you're saying is, why can't you run the same kind of argument for the zombie? So the zombie doesn't have consciousness, but they have some kind of relation to their states, which is, I mean, to take Jeff Lee's frame, consciousness-like, or there's some acquaintance-like property that they have. They're going to have beliefs that are justified in just the same way that their pain is bad, and it's in virtue of having the zombie pain state. So it's not the same as ours, but why isn't this smuggling in intuitions under another guise, basically, because you're saying that for them nothing's bad, but why aren't they justified in roughly the same way on this way of thinking?
Well, first, let me make a meta theoretical remark. So one thing I'm not saying is not one thing I'm not saying. Sorry, I am not saying that intuitions play no role in the justification of any of the ethical or meta-ethical claims that I want to endorse. I think that, ultimately things will to some extent come down to intuitions. But what I'm saying is that we can develop a meta-ethical theory where the justification for first-order ethical beliefs does not rely upon intuitions, even if the justification for that meta-ethical theory itself ultimately does come down to certain more basic philosophical intuitions. So I just wanted to clarify that first. So then for the stuff you're saying about acquaintance, I mean, there I'm not sure what to say. I feel like I have to just point and say well, that's not real acquaintance. You just introspect your experience, and you can see that there's a special relation that occurs there. And I mean, just to be clear, I'm generally skeptical of what falls under the heading of acquaintance theories in the epistemology of experience. So I think that there's all sorts of ways in which people overrate our epistemic relationship to our own experiences, and that we should be very careful in diagnosing, just what we're in a position to know about our own experiences. But that's compatible with thinking that there is a fundamentally different epistemic relationship between ourselves and our own experiences versus the zombie and the quasi experiences that the zombie has. I think this kind of relates to recent discussions of illusionism about consciousness. So you're not an illusionist, and suppose that somebody makes the analogous point to you about illusionism. I feel like it's hard to know what to say. You sort of have to just point to consciousness and be like, well, there is consciousness, it exists, and there's not much to say by way of argument here, but that's sort of just a fact that we're in a position to know.
Yeah, no, I agree about the illusionist point. I definitely am no fan of illusionism, but I still think that, I think the illusionism theory is a theory of zombie consciousness or zombie states or whatever. So if illusionism is true, then we're zombies. And if there are zombies, then the illusionism is true of them. But still there's something there which they're justified in saying that pain is bad for them. Seems like they're justified in saying that.
Wait, so you're talking about the zombies or the illusionists?
I think they're the same. So the zombies is who I'm talking about. They say pain is bad. They say it's because they have some relationship to something of theirs. So that seems to me to be, it's not the same as ours, because we do have consciousness. Obviously, I agree with you on that. And that's different between us and them. But nonetheless, why aren't they justified in thinking that pain is bad for them? Whatever they have is seemingly bad for them. And if I knew a zombie, let's suppose that we lived in a sort of world, not like ours, I think, where the laws dictate that everyone is conscious. But let's suppose you could have zombies amongst us. You know, I don't know, maybe Dennis is a zombie. Let's just pretend. So Dennis is a zombie, or some Dennett-esque creature's a zombie. They have no conscious states, but they go around saying pain is bad. I think that gives me a reason not to hurt them. I don't think that I'd be justified in saying, but you're a zombie, so I'm gonna chop you up. If they say pain is bad and they prefer not to have it happen to them, then whether they really have what I call pain seems sort of irrelevant to the way, whether they're justified or not in thinking that's bad.
So let me say a couple of things here. One is that in the scenario you just articulated, I think I'm inclined to agree with you that in that scenario, if you hear, Dan Dennett saying pain is bad and don't hurt me, then you would have reason to not hurt him. And that's because it's very hard to imagine a scenario where you know for sure that Dan Dennett is a zombie. And you're also just so confident in, your, well, let's say that it's me. I'm so confident in my philosophical beliefs that I'm going to discount, pure disagreement and all of that. And I'm just certain that one, Dennett is a zombie, and two, that I'm right that only conscious experiences or only conscious entities are welfare subjects. So I think that you have to sort of imagine something kind of far-fetched in order to make that actually work. And in any actual circumstance where these kinds of things might happen, then because of just uncertainty, because of the limits of our epistemic abilities, then we should exercise caution. I was also going to say on the more general point, I think that the relevant issues here about the justification for our belief that pain is bad versus how we should think about the zombie case. I don't think there's anything special about value beliefs here. I mean, I think that the very same kinds of issues arise when we're thinking about just regular old phenomenal beliefs. If, we think about just my belief that I'm in pain or that I'm having a red experience versus when the zombie, makes reports uttering the same sentences, then there's a question, why shouldn't we accept what the zombie is saying there? And or more generally, how should we think about what's going on in the zombie case? I guess in regards to how I'm inclined to think about what's going on in the zombie case, though, it seems to me that the zombie, this is only a partial diagnosis, but it seems to me that the zombie isn't even thinking a thought with the same content. And that's because in order to, I think there are certain conditions on being able to think about phenomenology that the zombie doesn't satisfy. There's a question of how exactly to characterize those conditions, but sometimes people talk about an experience requirement on phenomenal concepts, or you might think there's an imagination requirement. And assuming that the zombie doesn't satisfy these requirements, it's a bit hard to know how to even make sense of the situation, because when the zombie says I'm in pain, or maybe when the zombie says my pain is bad, they're not even saying the same thing that we're saying. I mean, they're saying the same sentence, but they're not expressing the same proposition.
Right. But so I agree with all that. I agree. They don't have the same phenomenal concepts. They couldn't, because you had to have the experience to acquire those concepts. So I agree with all that sort of stuff. But my point was sort of more on the Jeff. Maybe I've been too convinced by Jeff. I've been talking to Jeff too much. I read his book and I wasn't wholly convinced, but it at least got me thinking that they have something. It's not consciousness, but there's some state that they're thinking about and expressing that it's bad for them. And it just seems kind of arbitrary to say, but it's not really bad for them. It's only bad if it's conscious, and it's not our consciousness. So there's no other state that's not phenomenally conscious, which would be bad for them to have. And it just seems that's like an unargued part of this framework, and that so I don't know. I don't really have a clear objection. I'm just sort of rambling.
Right. No, that's an interesting thought. So let me ask you this then. So you're wanting to say that the zombie, they don't have phenomenal consciousness, but they have something else that's analogous in various ways.
Right.
And are you also wanting to say that when the zombie says, I'm in pain, yeah, they're not expressing the proposition that they're in pain, but they're expressing a nearby proposition that's analogous in various ways.
Yes.
So then
I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm saying that I'm kind of open to that idea.
Sure. And and Jeff thinks something like this.
Right, exactly.
So then I guess what I'm wondering here then is, why not also extend the same line of reasoning to the value belief, where when the zombie says, my pain is bad, they're not expressing the claim that their pain is bad because they can't even think about pain. And maybe they don't have a concept of badness that is latching onto the same notion that our concept of badness is. So they're saying something about themselves. Maybe under the right kind of metasemantic story, they're even making a true utterance, but the content of their utterance is going to be different. They're not talking about pain. And what I want to suggest is maybe they're not even talking about badness. They're talking about schmadness. And
schmain is schmad is what they're saying. The proposition.
They're saying my schmain is schmad. And then my thought is, okay, sure, that seems fine. Like I don't care about schmain. I don't care about schmad things.
But why not? They schmear about schmain. So isn't schmearing close enough to caring, and isn't schmain close enough to pain? I mean, I don't see, what the principal reason for drawing the line right there is.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I feel like that gets into some very deep metaphilosophical and metasemantic questions about, for any domain of philosophy where there's always going to be nearby concepts that latch onto different things, but that play similar roles. And we can ask, why should we be caring about truth or knowledge or consciousness or value or whatever, rather than the shma analogs
yeah, exactly.
of those things. So here's the first thought. I guess it seems to me that I'm in agreement with you that this is a puzzle, and I think that this is something that is a legitimate question to ask. And I'm not really sure what I want to say here, but I also think it's a puzzle for everyone. It doesn't seem to me that it's a puzzle that is particular to this domain. Instead, it seems to me that it's something that's extremely general. I guess I'm also kind of attracted to a picture where there's natural joints in reality, not just in concrete reality, but also in when we're thinking about abstract things or normative things and so forth. And that there's the right kind of metasemantic story will make it so that there's certain that our terms tend to latch onto the joints of those realities. So then that makes me think that either maybe the zombie is saying something false because the zombie analog of consciousness is just not picking out a natural kind. Or maybe it is picking out something different, but it's just not very important because that different thing is not a natural kind. I'm not really sure what to think there, but I guess that's the sort of move that seems attractive to me in this case, for breaking that parallel. And that requires, being on board with this idea of there being certain joints to reality and our terms tending to latch onto those joints. But I guess that seems to me antecedently plausible. And it also seems to me like you just need to make this kind of assumption in order to do philosophy in all sorts of circumstances.
Right.
So that's sort of the direction I'm inclined to go.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I have a million things I could talk to you about. It's very interesting, but I got to let you go at some point. And I know I hear rumblings of kids downstairs. So in conclusion, I wonder just quickly if there's anything that you were hoping was going to come up in this discussion that didn't. And the answer can be no, but I'm curious.
No, I mean, you covered the two main research projects that I have. I mean, I'm interested in basically all things consciousness. So, yeah, I'm interested in all sorts of stuff, but we had a pretty wide ranging discussion. There's, yeah, of course, a lot of other things that we could talk about, but there's not anything that stands out in my mind that I really wanted to get to that we didn't get to.
Okay.
And it seemed like you really did a good job of like doing your homework and
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm seriously interested in your work. I think your work is interesting and important. I want people to be aware of it because I think your approach, the way you think about these questions is very cool. So
thanks. I
certainly.
really appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, and you're welcome back anytime, you know.
And what was the topic of your metaethical dissertation?
Well, I tried to combine a kind of, an emotivism about normative judgments, such that when you say X is wrong, you're expressing a kind of attitude, an affective attitude, but also the belief that the attitude is the correct one to hold so that it could be justified, so that you could have a kind of moral realism and also capture what I thought was psychologically important about emotivism, which is that the emotional states are important in our moral judgments, but not a pure emotivism that's just like yay, boo, but like, a yay, but there's reasons for yay sort of view, so that ultimately you could have any sort of first order normative view attaching to justification of the belief aspect of it. A large part of it just philosophy of language, trying to nail out what speech act is involved and how you express both of the attitudes at the same time, the emotion and the belief, and how the beliefs can justify emotional responses and things of that nature.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, there's a million things I could ask you there too, but yeah, but I'll let you go too.
Well, it was my pleasure talking with you. Hang out for just a second and I'll say bye off air real fast. But otherwise, thanks again very much.
All right. Great talking to you.
All right, we're clear.